Professor Chandra Krishnamurthy and other dignitaries on the dais, esteemed delegates, colleagues from my department and other departments of Pondicherry University and French Institute of Pondicherry, media representatives, invitees, students, officers from Pondicherry University, esteemed finance officer of our university, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, understanding of agrarian change in the modern world started with the analysis of relationship between capitalism and peasantry. Although the study of agrarian structure goes back to the classic doctrines of political economy of the 18th and 19th centuries, systematic analysis in agrarian change started only towards the end of 19th century with the emergence of a debate between Marxist and neo-populist on agrarian transition. Based on his historical experience, Marx observed the classic case of agrarian transition in England, but he and Engels together emphasized the political apathy and enduring existence of peasantries that capitalism failed to eliminate, especially in France. Marx's economic analysis led him to believe that the peasantry could not survive in the long run. He expected that this class would tend to disappear, with most becoming displaced from the land and joining the proletariat. Subsequent Marxist revisionists, particularly Lenin and Kautsky, explained the existence of diversity in the development of capitalism in agriculture. Lenin indicated paths of transition to capitalism in farming from above the Prussian path and from below the American path. In contrast, Chayanov argued that changes in peasant economy operate according to its own laws of development rather than by the logic of capitalism. A wealth of literature flourished from this debate, covering analysis of historical and contemporary cases from peripheral political economies to those of advanced capitalist formations beginning with 1960s. However, by the end of 20th century, new understanding have been attached onto the classical account of the agrarian transition developed in the 19th century, particularly by scholars like T.J. Byers and Henry Bernstein, who is present here. The impulse to universalize and essentialize the grand narratives has declined, taking into account the new empirical circumstances that includes a wider set of processes shaping rural production like agricultural expansion to new zones of production, intensification of production techniques, urbanization and industrialization of land uses and livelihoods, environmental change, effects of migration on agrarian production, changing role of state, etc. In India, agrarian issues were the core of research over a period of 3 decades, beginning with 1960s, and the dominant line of inquiry was mainly focused on identifying the nature and extent of the growth of capitalism in agriculture. However, both Marxian and non-Marxian theories of agrarian transformation drawn on historical experiences of developed countries could not reflect any such path of transformation in India, which has witnessed complex effects of both planning and colonialism. The mode of production debate based on text of Marx and Lenin tapered off without a broad consensus, as there was little evidence to suggest that peasant agriculture in India would transform through proletarianization. In course of 1980s, agrarian change lost its central position in the academic agenda, and a decline in the interest became conspicuous in the last 2 decades, mainly due to the effect of neoliberal reforms, which raised a variety of new issues and contradictions beyond the classic theoretical and conceptual frame of agrarian change. From 1990s, the influence of global capitalism and neoliberal reforms has set in motion a process of unprecedented agrarian change in scale and speed. It marked a shift from the planned but slow growth process to market-driven rapid growth, accompanied by changes in a government policy for agricultural development. The traditional agrarian structures, which were transformed under the impact of colonialism and planning, have been significantly and dynamically altered within and across states, paving the way for transition to urban industrial-based capitalist economy. The accumulation of agricultural land by multinational corporations and the increasing privatization of natural resources like water, forest and mineral resources intensified the process of urbanization and industrialization, leading to market integration, migration and environmental transformation. Large-scale land acquisition have been undertaken for setting up industries, townships, mega cities and special economic zones with greater entry of private capital. Hence, it is essential to know how this transition from rural agriculture-based feudal economy to urban industrial-based capitalist economy is taking shape. Recently, a debate has already been initiated among few scholars. For example, Professor Usha Patnaik, Partha Chatterjee, James Lecce, Barbara Harris White, Tom Brass, Raju Das and others, many of them are present here, on nature of this transition. While one line of argument is that transition to capitalism has already taken place, the other view is that there is a slow process of transition. Yet another view is that transition has been bypassed. It is also argued that transition is unlikely to happen in India due to the effects of democratic politics. However, most of the scholars engaged in this debate have confined themselves to few aspects of agrarian change covering limited evidences. Hence, this debate needs to be substantiated and extended further both at theoretical and empirical level to address a number of key questions. It is in this context the seminar is organized. The seminar intends to address the following major questions. A. What are the emerging changes in Indian agrarian economy and society under the influence of neoliberal reforms and global capitalism? B. Do these changes lead to transition from rural-based feudal economy to urban industrial-based capitalist economy? If yes, C. If yes, in which way this transition is similar to and different from the classical model? D. How do the different regions and states which are at different level of socio-economic development experience this transition? E. What is the response of various categories of rural population to this transition? In the next 2 days, I am sure we will be able to address these questions and many other allied issues. We have received a good number of papers by eminent social scientists from India and abroad. Besides the inaugural and valedictory sessions, the remaining deliberations are organized in 6 sessions. With this, now I come to my pleasant duty of welcoming our guests, which is a great privilege and honor for me here. First of all, I would like to welcome our Honorable Vice-Chancellor, Professor Chandra Krishnamurthy. She joined this university as its first women Vice-Chancellor, and since her joining, university has witnessed significant development on many fronts. Really, we are greatly honored and privileged to have you, Madam, here to preside over this function. On behalf of the Department of Sociology, I extend a very hearty and warm welcome you to Madam. We have with us one of the distinguished and best known anthropologists, Professor Joan Mecher, who has done pioneering work on agrarian transformation in India with a special focus on Tamil Nadu. I extend a very special and warm welcome you to Madam. I welcome my senior colleague and Dean of the School of Social Sciences and International Studies, Professor Venkatara Gautam, and also my departmental colleague, Dr. Ramatirtha. I extend very warm and hearty welcome to all the delegates, especially Professor Henry Bernstein, Professor Usha Patnaik, Professor Barbara Harris White, Professor Harun Akram Lodhi, Professor D.N. Dhanagre, Professor Mark Edelman, Professor Hira Singh, Professor James Lecce, Professor Judith Hare, Professor Theodore D. Silva, Professor J. Taramangalam, Dr. Freywood Tesfaye, Dr. J. Cavalian, Dr. Jonathan Patendon, Dr. Daniel Munster, Professor Gaurangandan Sahai, Professor R. Vijay, Dr. Santanu Rakit, Professor Mamta Swai, and many other delegates, and colleagues from Pondicherry University and French Institute of Pondicherry. I also take this opportunity to welcome our esteemed finance officer who has helped us generously in granting financial support along with the Vice-Chancellor and the entire university administration. I also take this opportunity to welcome him. I also welcome the press representatives, faculty, students, one and all. I wish your presence would not only be satisfying, but also be meaningful and memorable. Thank you, everyone.
The title of my talk is People-Centered versus Profit-Centered Agriculture. What each means for the survival of planet Earth as a living planet, and where does SRI-SCI fit in? When I first started work in South India, more than half a century ago, there was considerable idealism about the future of India among the still living and functioning freedom fighters, especially those devoted to lessening inequality and to creating a socialist state and undoing the horrendous impact of colonialism. It was only 11 years after Indian independence, and there were numerous problems to be solved to change the focus from being a colony to being a strong, independent country. At that time, there was a strong focus on import substitution, so as to not be dependent on either the former colonial powers or the US. Agriculture under the British had focused on export from India and a little bit to feed the British who happened to be living in India as colonists. There was considerable discussion at that time about issues of land reform, not only on the left, but also among many belonging to the then Congress Party, especially those who had gone to jail during the anti-British protests and who were deeply influenced by Gandhi, as well as others. Yet, as Eric Ross, an anthropologist, has shown, in the decades just after the end of the Second World War, peasants everywhere were demanding land. While they sought access to unused and underutilized lands in the hands of large landowners, it was one of the tenets of Western policy towards agrarian change, a view that would rationalize the emergence of what would later come to be called the Green Revolution by the 1960s. That there were no lands on which to expand food production, such as the Western Hemisphere or Australia had been in the past, and that in the light of mounting population pressure, the only solution to what the Americans feared as a Malthusian specter was to enhance per unit of available land through technical means. In this way, the Malthusian fears which propelled the logic of the Green Revolution effectively helped to put land reform on hold as a central feature of agrarian development. It set the interests of the governments of the United States and Western Europe squarely at odds with millions of peasants around the world who sought to reclaim precious cultivable lands that colonial powers and their descendants had over the centuries appropriated for non-subsistence production. In the process, it provided unprecedented opportunities for the intensification of capitalist relations of production in third world agriculture. Contempt and disdain for the poor, especially if they belong to different ethnic groups or colors, has a long history in the West, among the upper classes especially, as Ross clearly showed in his book. The US, which had become the dominating power after World War II, especially in the UK, lost many of its colonies to independence struggles, supported some kind of land reform, but only because it was seen as a way of fighting communism. And this was very short-lived. American leaders believed that even then, if land reform was always, land reform was always better if it conformed to US objectives rather than to an agenda set by the people of the country. And this is, of course, what was done with Japan right at the end of World War II. The Green Revolution had never been regarded only or even primarily about producing more food, but about creating a global food system which peasant agriculture, widely regarded by elites in the West and elsewhere as backward and unproductive in terms of a modern market economy, which itself was said to be threatened by demographic pressures in developing countries, was subordinated to or replaced by a more commercial and capital-intensive production, i.e. like an industrial firm. What the US and its Indian allies, the young students sent to US agricultural universities for PhDs, wanted to push from the 1960s on was the undermining of land reform and the push for so-called modern agriculture, and I put that in quotes, including a wide variety of material inputs, which of course had to be purchased each season, meaning great profits for the companies. In the 1960s, there was a pairing of individual Indian agricultural universities and US land-grant agricultural universities carried out by USAID people working in India. Scholarships were offered to promising Indian doctoral students in agricultural economics primarily at their university their state agricultural university was aligned with. This happened over a decade or more. Interestingly, when Prime Minister Shastri asked US President Johnson for help at a time in the 1966-67, when the monsoons had failed and people were suffering, he was pressured to agree to give up any ambitions for land reform and to accept US food imports for a period of time, not just as a short-term expedient, but rather what led to the so-called PL 480 bill in the United States government. There was a persistent belief among Americans advising Indians that India's main problems were due to population pressure, not colonial period administrative neglect or destruction of the countryside. Importantly, the US wanted to bring in the new, quote, industrial approach to agriculture, which had so badly hurt US rural areas as a way to, quote, save Indian agriculture. It clearly fit with the US elite approach and was also supported by the then former British colonial way of thinking. After all, the British had forced their small farmers off the land 1.5 to 2 centuries earlier to support the Industrial Revolution. As Eric Ross proceeded to note, if the Green Revolution ensured the countrywide evolutionary modernization of third world agriculture, it was in good measure because of the central assumption among the US advisors that the increased output necessary to forestall imminent Malthusian scarcity was only achievable through the introduction of new high-yielding varieties, again, something that had to be bought every single season. The essence of the Green Revolution, it also depended on using lots of pesticides, irrigation, fertilizer, and later on herbicides. The essence of the Green Revolution was the commodification of agriculture and the building of factories and profits for man-made things, chemicals, machinery, and the wages for non-agricultural employees. The fact that the Soviets' large-scale farms were also industrialized added to the push in India, since the left could not object to this approach. Both on the left and the right and the center, for the most part, did not see chemical agriculture as hurting the environment, though of course it has done tremendous harm. From the early beginning of social stratification, elites tended to look at those doing the dirty work of agriculture, their hands in the dirt or soil, as less educated or intelligent. It is only now that we are beginning to understand the important role of soil biota in the growth cycles of plants, and are combining agroecological knowledge with other knowledge about plant growth cycles, amounts of nutrients needed, water needed, temperature needs, differences for diverse soils, etc. Or, as Norman Uphoff recently noted in a letter to the SRI India network, the conjoint management of plants, soil, water, and nutrients together with a particular genotype or genetic potential is more important than focusing on which genotype will be superior to some other one. This is something that he had sent out in a letter in the middle of January this year. I was working in rural Tamil Nadu when the Americans were building their first fertilizer plant there, and everyone was pushing for American-style agriculture in India. I was horrified. But as an anthropologist, not an economist, nothing I could say to anyone made any impression, except the articles that were accepted by the EPW and in my own book on agriculture. From 1963 onwards, over and over again, I was told by the Agricultural Administration, and especially, I should say, in Tamil Nadu, that the village farmers were simply ignorant and I should not pay any attention to what they told me. The use of high-yielding varieties spurred fertilizer demand, which meant a greater commodification of agriculture at the expense of traditional processes. Looking back, I'm even more impressed by the predictions of these so-called uneducated farmers. Many of them predicted that the use of chemicals would lead to an ever-increasing need for more and more as the land was saturated by them, killing all organisms. They knew, but they didn't count. In the 1960s, after Nehru's death in '64, only Kerala and West Bengal continued with issues connected to land reform. And at least in Kerala, where I know much more about it, land reform ended up being land to the tenants, not to the tillers. And I've documented that and talked about that in other articles. People were proud that the tillers got permanent rights to sites where their houses were located, but nobody noted that in other states, such as Tamil Nadu, the cherries where the untouchable homes were placed had always been theirs. If land reform had occurred, especially if the poor were allowed to make claims to small amounts of cultivable land, it might have helped in part to lessen the impact of caste, especially untouchability in the countryside. Where I have lived and worked both in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, there is still a close connection between caste and ownership of land. Most of the elites do not own cultivable land. The only time the elites came to own land was when one of them, through a combination of luck and very, very hard work, managed to make enough to buy some land. And even now, the land they own is rarely irrigated and often lacks access to water. In some cases, they use rainwater harvesting, but only rarely. I was supposed to visit one of those villages on my way here. We'll only go after the meeting because of time constraints this week. One other interesting point, reading the handbooks for several other districts in Tamil Nadu for the 1960s, which I happened to find I had in New York, I was struck by the fact that the government had been recommending some of the elements of SRI, though not the entire practice perhaps. What was being recommended, and this was in the 1962 South Arcot District Handbook, written in 1961, was the use of 10 to 15-day-old seedlings, using only 1 or 2 in a hole, and not too much water. This is quite striking. All of this disappeared immediately when the Green Revolution approach was taught to the agricultural departments. Interestingly, there appears to also be some new evidence of yields for the second half of the 18th century for Chengalpat district, as it was then defined in a book from 2011, which comes from palm leaf manuscript indicating that paddy yields were quite high during this period of time. It is based on the Chengalpat survey of 1967 to 74, where detailed information is presented for 2 localities. In the late 60s and 70s, at the time of the Green Revolution, Indian agriculture could have gone in either direction, or even in a diverse combination of the two. It could have been more pro-farmer, giving tenants an even proportion of agricultural laborers land rights via land reform that they had been agitating for, and helping them to innovate, or in the direction the U.S. and its advisors and the Indians trained in the U.S. thought was modern. Ignoring soil biota, helping the corporations to sell their products, with models of the U.S. and to some extent Soviet agriculture. It is clear to me that with the so-called transformation of agriculture, or perhaps it is better to call the pressures to transform it as a result of political pressures and the influence of the U.S. and of course its multinational corporations, such as the fertilizer and chemical plants that have been erected, and more recently Monsanto and its Indian affiliate Michael. The recent emphasis on hybrids, which can of course be sold each year to the farmers instead of them using their own seeds, is part of this picture, even though most people prefer the taste of the older varieties and will, if they can afford it, pay more to buy them. Until recently, there has been a neglect of traditional seeds, though in some places they're coming back. There is a growing pressure for capital to seize hold of agriculture, revolutionize it, and attempt to make all forms of production and property untenable, and to create the necessity for newer ones. In several places in Tamil Nadu, some of the seeds I saw being used back in the 1960s are responding very well to SRI methodology. I raised the question, how are the US neoliberal approaches and power influencing those with political power in India and forcing this type of commodification of agriculture? A related question is, how can and do ordinary persons fight it? What can be done to help them? And then I have a short comment about Barbara's paper and some of the things that I have been working on. In a paper I will not be presenting here, I have discussed challenges for developing countries and I've contrasted two approaches: the commodity market versus growing food for people to eat, including local people, even the farmers. I've noted the role of agricultural traders in the international markets. I raised questions about their rights to use banks and even pension funds to bet on crop prices, including leveraged soybeans, wheat, rice, azuki beans, etc., and how the high prices translate directly into misery and malnutrition. I raised a question, which I don't know the full answer to, maybe some of the economists do, of how did investors get their hands on food? What does it all mean? Who are the food speculators? Are they investment banks, pension funds, even university ones, hedge funds, grain traders, trading rice and individual traders? As noted in the New Internationalist, with growing public arrogance of banks worldwide, the time is pretty ripe for a clampdown on speculation. I raised the question, is food for eating or for indexing and leveraging or betting? Or put another way, is food grown primarily for humans and other life forms to eat, or for massive profits for inputs to multinational corporations? Which is it for? According to the Land Stewardship newsletter, which is put out by grassroots women, mostly, working in the Midwest of the United States, research at the University of Minnesota shows that worldwide, only 55% of crop calories nourish people. And in the US, it's only 34%. The rest goes to livestock or biofuel. Clearly, making grain or other food into gas is not what the world needs. Giving up or changing the feeding of animals in CAFOs, as in the US, China, and increasingly at least for chickens around most large Indian cities, and instead feeding less animals that way and focusing on feeding human beings more vegetable protein is what's really needed. When I first started to work in rural villages, after having worked for my PhD in a slum in New York City, agriculture in the US and other parts of the so-called developed world was still undergoing massive capture by the forces of capitalism. From 1959 to 1978, the number of farms in the United States decreased by 39%, from almost 4 million to a little over 2 million, while the area of land in cultivation decreased by 10%. Once the US has succeeded in pushing a significant number of US farmers out of agriculture, either into then still functioning factories or into slums where they often could not find work, this ideology and approach was brought to Latin America and, of course, South Asia. There is a tendency to underestimate the influence of the US on Indian agriculture and food tastes. I cannot go into it here enough, but the influence of US food preferences for some of their own traditions in China has, for the first time in history, led to diabetes being found there in significant numbers. While diabetes did exist in India earlier on, in China it did not exist. And the diabetes being found now is massive and shocking. Traditionally, even among their own elite, diabetes was not at all common in China. Just a few days ago, the New York Times, in an article about India's producing anti-cancer medicines that have been patented, noted the enormous increase of cancer in India. I would like to suggest that apart from the fact that some people are living longer, A significant reason to be further investigated, obviously, could include the massive increased use of pesticides. And there have been several studies of this done, and I have a separate bibliography of that if anybody really wants it. The Center for Science and Environment in Delhi a few years back published in their journal the results of a survey by the Consumer Voice of vegetables in markets in Delhi, and found that all of it had a very high incidence of both pesticides and lead. It's hard to wash those off. I had the experience about 2 or 3 years ago of visiting one of the NGOs I work with nowadays in Wayanad in Kerala, and the first time I went there, the female head could not meet me. The next day when I met her, she burst into tears and told me she had been at the funeral for a young man in his 30s who had just passed away from cancer. He was growing bananas for the market, and bananas use a large amount of pesticide. No one in his family had ever died at such a young age. But it's possible, the research obviously remains to be done, that it was due to his exposure to the pesticide. Possibly the massive increase in the use of chemical pesticides in India since I first started working in the early 1960s could be a factor. In some cases, we even find accidental poisoning of school lunches, as was recently reported by Med India for Bihar, where 22 children were killed in late December by organic phosphate poisoning of school lunches. A senior education official surmises that the contamination may have come from vegetables or rice in the lunch. A doctor treating some of the children said it could have been vegetable oil. Unfortunately, this isn't the first case of such illness or food poisoning to come from the program. What SRI-SCI for rice, wheat, sugarcane, lentils, and a wide variety of other crops has done, apart from producing significant improvements in yields, has been to reinstate farm autonomy, as farmer field schools and farmer-to-farmer exchanges have begun to be a norm in some areas. It has not only given some farmers at least significant yield increases, perhaps more importantly, brought back their excitement to innovate. Local farmers are the ones who have been working on the new weeders, which push the weeds underneath and aerate the soils, not destroying the weeds, but using them. These are also approaches that make it clear that one size or one approach does not fit everybody, that there has to be tremendous variation depending on the soil, the place, the crop, the availability of water, all sorts of things. Azupop noted recently in commenting on how the yields from farmers' SRI fields have consistently been better than on ICAR and related institutional fields, on-station plots have been managed for years with large input of, that is on agricultural stations, large imports of inorganic fertilizers and agrochemical protectorants, which have adversely affected the soil biota and balancing it. He goes on to note that the responsiveness that one sees in any particular trial may be due not so much to the variety itself, the genotype, as to the genotype along with the environmental interaction. He points out that there is no right or wrong, that what there is clearly is site-specific and also rainfall and other varying climatic changes going on, and no one set of timings or spacings or seeds are optimum. This gives the farmers more opportunity to innovate where they know the land, where they know the seeds, where they know the place, but also calls forth their ingenuity. He also contrasts the difference between highest yields and preferred varieties, which have highest market prices. So what kind of an agricultural transition is going on, and what does the future bring? Climate change is at this point inevitable, even if we were to stop releasing CO2 and methane into the air completely. Monsoons have always been variable, but are increasing in their variability. Water conservation, recycling of water, and the processing of water used to wash bodies or vegetables to clear things is essential. Tamil Nadu is especially vulnerable because the northeast monsoon is even more variable than the southwest one. SRI clearly saves water, and so does SCI for sugarcane, all pulses and lesser grains, which are coming back after a long hiatus. It's interesting, when I first collected data from villages, the number of different grains that were grown along with rice, either the same time or in back the next season or the next crop, etc., was looked down upon. At one time, it became an insult to call someone a ragi head. That was the insult that was used for most of the Dalits. They were ragi heads because they ate ragi. Nowadays, ragi is prescribed by doctors for people with diabetes. People are also beginning to use simple and less expensive forms of sprinkler systems to water crops using far less water. Today, many young men are leaving agriculture looking for the more glamorous factory jobs, even if they have to live 6 or 8 to a room. Yet, interestingly, the latest census shows that smaller cities close to rural areas are expanding faster than the megacities. That means they're going to places close to home. Meanwhile, more and more women are managing their farms. Worldwide, there's a growing interest among women in doing agriculture, from growing grains to vegetables to fruits to small animals, etc. This is growing, and it's seen as empowering by many women. I'm in the process of working with a colleague in Hyderabad, Dr. Kanabiran, on setting up a conference on women in agriculture for sometime in 2015. And hopefully we can get women from all over the world who are happy to finally be in charge of their farms. But in India, there needs to be more land put in the names of women or in couples with equal control on decision making. And perhaps some of the young men running off will also decide to come back. I'll conclude by asking whose knowledge is valued and why. Is it useful or is profit the only value to be considered? Why must we assume there will be an agrarian transition? Perhaps, if we survive the 21st century, we will find that healthier families live on small farms. That does not imply a lack of education, but being safer from chemical poisoning and with greater contact with where food comes from. Also, with closer human relations. We need to encourage farmers of all sizes, even the smallest, to make use of their understanding of agriculture and to again recognize that they have the capacity to solve many of the problems wherever they live. There needs to be a serious encouragement for farmers to solve problems either by themselves or working with other local farmers, something the farmers' field schools, which have been developed quite a lot in Tamil Nadu, do excellently. If farmers are to be independent of the MNCs, especially if they are using SRI or SCI, they need to think things through and to be aided in doing so by being shown respect for their ideas and approaches. And as noted by Polanyi a long time ago, not relying on market mechanisms. Quote, to allow the market mechanism to be the sole director of the fate of human beings and their natural environment, indeed, even of the amount and use of purchasing power, would result in the demolition of society. For the alleged commodity labor power cannot be shoved about and used indiscriminately or even left unused without affecting the human individual who happens to be the bearer of this particular commodity. Robbed of the protected coloring of cultural institutions, human beings would perish from the effects of social exposure. They would die as victims of acute social dislocation through perversion, crime, starvation, etc. Ideally, we would also like to see small companies that not only focus on profit, though obviously they would need to make enough to survive, but also on helping small and medium farmers to get their ideas out to other small farmers without having to pay much for doing so. That is to encourage people in both rural and urban areas to focus their lives on different values. Gandhi was once asked whether he would like India to develop as much as Britain. He replied that Britain was such a small country, but it required the plunder of half the planet to bring about development. Therefore, if a large country like India is to develop in the same way, it will probably require the plunder of several planets. And this is, I think, very true. But he was certain that even though those planets were available, he would never want this country to follow that path. Clearly, people and policy can destroy Tamil Nadu agriculture or get rid of most farmers. But doing so would create a worse problem than we can imagine, because there are no urban jobs that would feed the majority of people and lead to their having decent lives, clean water, air, and a sense of community. I could go on with all of this, but now everyone wants to go to dinner. So let me conclude by wishing all of you an enjoyable conference. And again, I think thank the convener for bringing all of us here. Thank you.
respected Vice-Chancellor of Pondicherry University, Professor Chandra Krishnamurthy, esteemed Professor Joan Mecher, Finance Officer of our university, the respected Head of the Department of Sociology, my colleagues in the university, distinguished delegates and students. I deem it a great honor, a privilege indeed, to be invited to present my views on this very important theme before such a distinguished galaxy of sociologists and social scientists. I thank my colleague, Professor B.B. Mohanty, for this very singular honor accorded to me. I'm a historian both by training and by inclination, and therefore I will approach this theme from the perspective of my own discipline. And as was just mentioned, I happen to be the student of Professor Burton Stein, whose work on the peasant society of medieval South India perhaps is a landmark study of agrarian transition in one very important phase, that is from the medieval to what can be called early modern, or what we now say a more colonial-oriented economy, which his work on Sir Thomas Munro accomplished. So I'll approach this from my own discipline with the thought that a historical perspective may not be out of place in an intellectual climate today that valorizes the present and disregards the longue durée as an unnecessary afterthought. It's unfortunate. Today we are caught in the present, the moment that springs into eternity. We don't look back and see that history has a lot to offer, and the insight of history can enrich any kind of analysis of society. And I can only think of the great historians like E.J. Hobsbawm and Christopher Hill and Keith Thomas, all of whom at some point in life had talked about this transition, the transition from the medieval to what can be called the modern, or the transition from the agrarian to the industrial. And therefore, I think these works all need to be taken into consideration as we explore our own transition in the economy. Professor Joan Mecher had mentioned the survey that recorded in Chengalpet district in the between 1782 and 1786. This is the famous Barnard survey that was undertaken soon after Chengalpet was handed over to the East India Company. And it is a survey of nearly 2,400 odd villages. And it's the only survey anywhere in India that gives you household statistics. It gives you population by gender. It is an example of what the 18th century would call political arithmetic. And if you look at that, we find that the yields, as she rightly mentioned, that the yields in Chengalpet was almost 3 times what was accomplished after the advent of after the Green Revolution. So obviously history has something to offer, and we need to take history seriously. And in this forum, I would like to reach out to my distinguished colleagues who have come from all parts of the world to take history a tad more seriously than it is hitherto done. So, the theme of this seminar is Agrarian Transition in India. The singular agrarian transition is significant. It's not agrarian transitions, it is agrarian transition. That's why I underscore the singular. It is significant as it presupposes one giant wave of changes and institutional interventions reshaping the agrarian landscape. A historian will be a little more cautious. What we see are million mutinies, as V.S. Naipaul would say, or a million transitions. These transitions are particular both in time and space. And what we are seeing today is not just one kind of transition and embracing the whole of India, but variations in different parts of the world. And different regions of India are witnessing different manifestations of this agrarian transition, as I try to elaborate as I go along. So agrarian transformations are the product of deep-seated historical changes which are barely perceptible on the surface, and when dramatic events like a rash of farmer suicides take place, they are viewed as symptomatic of a pathology whose exact cure is as evanescent as the problem itself. Now, when we look at agrarian transition, we have to remember history, the great Indian famine of 1877 to 1879. And if you examine, fortunately, we have a very good historian who has documented that famine. I'm talking about Digby, who wrote the 2-volume history of the Great Indian Famine. But if you examine why that particular event took place, which caused a mortality of roughly about 6 to 8 million in parts of the Deccan and Southern and Madras Presidency, we notice a very important point. The farmer, the Indian farmer, who is generally seen to be quite unresponsive to market forces. Normally, that is how we stereotypically represent our farmers. They're not very alert to market forces. They're not very alert to the nuances of free trade. But the Suez Canal had opened up opportunities for the Indian farmer to export grain. And he was exporting grain to those markets from where he got the highest returns. And he could keep in touch with the markets because the telegraph was available to him to know where the grain was trading at the highest. So the Indian farmer was able to get into the arbitrage, even in the late 19th century. And of course, the export of grain led to disaster, which William Digby has so ably documented. What I'm trying to say is that when we look at agrarian transition, we have to contextualize it in a broader perspective. Look at the technological, geostrategic, and other changes that have taken place, and they are not specific only to India. And I've tried to indicate that by one example that comes immediately to mind, which is of course very familiar to all those who have worked on issues of peasant society and agrarian transitions in India. So we have large-scale transitions in the agrarian landscape which manifest themselves in many crucial ways. So what are those changes that we are now seeing? The pattern of land ownership has vastly changed. If you look at the 1871 census, and more recently, we don't go by ethnic identities anymore, but I'm sure it is possible to use certain other surrogates and establish who is owning land in different parts of India. We find that those who owned land or controlled land in the 19th century no longer do so. You have a whole new levels of land ownership that has emerged in different parts of South India. It has led also to some degree of rural violence, and it has also led to a great degree of social empowerment. It all depends on how these issues play out in different parts. So you have changes. So agrarian transition would mean changes in the pattern of land ownership. And here I think, again, I would like to alert my distinguished colleagues in the field of social sciences to the fact that in South India, land was never owned in the sense that the Western theory of legal ownership of land was tied to the whole idea of eminent domain, which in India, land ownership went with the idea of control over land and graded rights over the land. So land was to be used, land was to be ruled, but land was not a commodity that could be traded in the market, as indeed was the case in any society where you have the rule of eminent domain. In South India, or for that matter, even in the great Mughal Empire, we do not have the notion of eminent domain. And this prevented the advent of feudalism, and at the same time, it also prevented in many ways individualized ownership of land. And this complexity has to be factored in any analysis that we make of agrarian transition, the bundle of land rights. And when a group loses rights over the land, it becomes landless, as the great work of Dharma Kumar, Land and Caste, has tried to document. And this process started at least a few decades before the advent of the company rule in South India. So all these are markers of very important transition, and we can inform our discussion of agrarian transition if we take historical evidence very seriously. The structures of rural poverty has shifted from rural indebtedness to rural seasonal employment, and large swathes of India have witnessed a novel phenomenon. Agricultural labor is increasingly provided by migrant labor. This is something unique that we find in the last 20 years or so. Probably it is because of greater commercialization of agriculture, but the labor that is coming into agriculture, his labor that is brought in from different parts of India, migrant labor, and with the migrant labor, new kinds of political and, of course, issues of economic issues have emerged. Government schemes such as the much heralded Manrega scheme have not really addressed the problem engendered by the new trend of labor, of rural migrant labor. The shift from a political economy informed social science to one which is more based on identity, and interventionist-oriented social science inhibits, I would say, a correct perspective or even an understanding of important structural changes. Social science, of course, we have to take identity very seriously, but beyond identity, there is also the political economy of what exactly is happening in terms of our society. If new groups are gaining access to land and water and capital, and water is also very important in this equation, others are losing out. And that is the reason why a political economy work. Of course, Kathleen Gough attempted that 30 or 35 years ago, but after that we do not really have much analysis of the political economy of rural India. And of course, EPW and in other journals, we do see articles from time to time, but then the shift in social sciences that has taken place over the last 30 years has been one that leaves political economy issues away and goes more into identity. And this is something that we in social sciences keep debating. To what extent are issues of identity relevant in the analysis of great social and economic issues today? And I think in the field of history, we have now more or less come to the realization that while identity is important, there are issues that are more substantial at the heart of any kind of social and historical inquiry. Agrarian transformation is the theme of this seminar. Even as we speak, there is large-scale conversion of agricultural land for industrial and commercial purposes. And this has created a great deal of political problems. And we are all familiar with some of those issues: Nandigram, Shrimpur, the Yamuna Expressway controversies, etc. What is called the land acquisitions. There has been an attempt now to make land acquisitions a little more democratic and involve larger groups of people in land acquisition. But whether that would really solve the problem remains to be seen, because in this debate between development and land, which is more important, land rights of peasants or development for the society? And this is not a very easy issue to negotiate, and historians, social scientists are all grappling with this issue in a very significant way. Displacement of the peasantry caused by what is called development has largely been interpreted as a symptom of a predatory state despoiling the countryside. How is this issue viewed? Viewed both by social scientists as well as by activists. The issue of land acquisition is essentially viewed as a predatory state grabbing the land of the peasant and despoiling the countryside. But is that a fair perspective? Is something that we can talk about. And if we well, what we have done is essentially catalog a number of problems confronting this issue of agrarian transformation. But then there are, as was pointed out in the keynote address, many other issues that are symptomatic of agrarian transition. In the 1950s and 60s, we had the land grab movement in different parts of North India, which later took the form of the Buddha movement, and later, of course, out of that came one of the most important challenges on the agrarian front, of course, the Naxalite movement, which represented essentially the assertion of the marginalized and the oppressed, and seriously eroded the legitimacy of the state. And if we look at it, it's nearly 259 districts of India in some form or other are facing this particular problem that started way back in 1967. And this is very important. Why is it that this movement, this social movement, the Naxalite movement, that started in 1967 in a remote village in West Bengal, has embraced more than 250 districts, and the state has not really been effective in dealing with this. Is it an agrarian issue? Is it a political issue? Is it a social issue? Is it tribal versus peasants? There are a lot of other questions that this particular development raises. In the Rayatwari areas of southern India, for instance, you do not have the same manifestations of farmer distress as you have in parts of India which had a different mode of revenue assessment and collection. I'm not saying that one is the cause of the other, but I think what I'm saying is that one should look at the historical antecedents of these different developments and see whether history has a role to play in enabling us to understand the events. And then, of course, we have the PL 480 problem, which was one of the most important interventions in terms of the American support to the Green Revolution. Was the Green Revolution itself and the capital-intensive kind of agriculture that it brought in parts of northern India, that itself has led to very major problems. One has to just think of that in the Jat areas of northern India, it is the Green Revolution and the consequences of the Green Revolution that has created a kind of a gender preference that, of course, India has had to deal with internationally in a very awkward way. Is the Green Revolution itself a part of where some of the responsibilities for creating gender preference in certain parts of northern India, because the Green Revolution increased productivity without really increasing profitability of agriculture. We have to see whether when productivity increases, does profitability also increase? And did that in itself have something to do with the gender preference and the way in which certain very unfortunate social developments have taken place? I'm just sharing some of these thoughts from my perspective as a historian, because I work with the knowledge of my discipline. I have not gone on field work. I don't study the present. I study the past. But by studying the past, I believe that that Indian society has inherited certain problems, and a study of those problems historically would enable us to have a better perspective, a better understanding. And that is what we are all in this game for. We may not change the world, but certainly we can understand the world better, because the point is not to change it. Probably we'll never be able to change the world, but at least at the end of the day, let us hope that we understand the world better, because that would bring us one step closer to a solution. So with these words, I once again thank my distinguished colleague, Professor B.B. Mohanty, for giving me this honor of sharing my thoughts with all of you. Thank you.
Good evening to one and all present, members on the dais, Professor Joan Mecher, Professor Gautam, Professor Atiraman, and Professor Mohanty. My other professorial colleagues of the dais, deans of the departments, invited for resource persons, and others who have come all the way to participate in this important conference on agrarian transition in India. First of all, I thank Professor Mohanty to make me part of this conference, which will deliberate for 2 more days on the various issues with respect to agrarian transition in India. It was indeed the first speaker, that is Professor Mohanty, who carved out or made a map of what has been the transition in his own imitable style. Then we had an exhaustive, detailed experience of Professor Joan Mecher in her imitable style, indicating the work that she has done and what, according to her, could be deliberated in various aspects that she outlined before us in her talk today. We had Professor Gautam telling us the historical perspective, and very nicely put, we learn from the past. So, knowing the past is equally important to deal with the future. Therefore, I think all my earlier speakers have spoken on today's topic, but I'm sure the deliberations tomorrow will be more focused on each of the issues that have been outlined as per the program and as also brought out by the various professors. With this prelude, I would like to say, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished participants who are here, it is a great pleasure for me to be with you. And I also welcome all of you to this international seminar on agrarian transition in India, which is organized by the Department of Sociology of our Pondicherry University. This 2-day seminar on critical agrarian changes from a cross-disciplinary perspective, covering a range of theoretical and empirical questions revolving around the agrarian transition, involving all the scholars who are here, the experts across the discipline from India and abroad who have been working on this issue. Definitely, the end of the seminar will see formulations, policies, which could be definitely be forwarded to the policy makers of the country. Understanding the agrarian change, as per my understanding, I believe, is what it has caused in this modern world can be started with the relationship between a capitalism and peasantry. The contemporary agrarian crisis that began in the mid-19th is much more than a mere outcome of a neoliberal policies adopted since 1991 as contemplated by some scholars. But the neoliberal reforms have certainly accentuated the crisis. Ecological strain resulting from an intensive monocropping and an extensive use of groundwater has imposed externalities. As a result, growth of agriculture considerably slowed down to 2.5% in 1991 to 2010, and its share in GDP declined to 13.4% in 2011-12. The traditional agrarian structures, which were transformed under the impact of colonialism and planning, have been significantly and dynamically altered within and across states, paving the way of transition to urban, industrial-based capitalist economy. The accumulation of agricultural land by multinational corporations, that which we have been seeing across the country, and increasing privatization of natural resources like water, forest and mineral resources, intensified the process of urbanization and industrialization, leading to market integration, migration and environmental transformation. There are various illustrations to illustrate this. Across the country, when we speak of the accumulation of the or the acquisition of the agricultural land by multinational corporation, one very illustrative, the history which about which Raghotama spoke was, all of you are aware what happened in Calcutta when the agricultural lands were taken up by the Tatars. Or even today's paper spoke about when water resources are being stopped or are being taken or in the name of urbanization or industrialization. So these factors have contributed to the transition, and large-scale land acquisition have been undertaken by setting up industries, townships, megacities, special economic zones with greater entry of private capital. The increasing control of agribusiness over input and output flows of agriculture, indicating a massive debauching workforce from this sector, is discernible. Land is no longer so important as the basis of status and power, neither does it serve to limit the livelihood possibilities of the poor. Non-agricultural sectors started growing rapidly, resulting in the perceptible decline in the share of agricultural GDPs. But the labor productivity as well as land productivity have fallen by half in the last three decades, and capital labor ratio has doubled in agriculture. As a result, employment growth has fallen to 0.16%. These are the symptoms of distress which compel the rural workers to migrate. Absence of adequate opportunities to migrate forces many to become subsistences farmers, and the vulnerability of losing subsistence lies in the very structure of petty commodity production. I will not elongate on what is petty commodity because the enlightened crowd here is already well aware of the various factors with respect to the transition in agrarian. Not only in India, I believe it is all over the world. The issue of agrarian constraint to capitalist growth is well debated during the planning era. It was widely prevalent view that modern sectors' growth suffered an accumulation crisis during mid-60s when no palpable agrarian surplus was forthcoming. Worse, the supply shortfalls of food grains production in the economy posed an inflationary barrier to growth. Indian state resolved the problem to some extent through technological means called the Green Revolution. Institutional interventions were built to enable the necessary market surplus for the capitalist sector, which ensures some basic viability for the farmer and the productivity growth for the sector. In the neoliberal era, there are tendencies to withdraw the mechanisms of intervention that involve subsidies and other expenditure, which tend to produce the crisis for the petty producers. However, compared to economies in the West, the trajectories of rural transformation have been quite distinct in India. While Western economies experienced a rapid and complete transition from agricultural to advanced capitalist or industrial society, the process of transformation in India reflects diverse manifestation due to uneven regional development, a production of economical and historical forces. The available statistics show There's a growing persistence in small-scale cultivation. The trend of rural to urban migration, which was increasing in India over the decades, has now shown a decline, and despite the increase in economic inequality. Newer types of agrarian movements, networks, and coalition emerged and gained political influence. Moreover, the conditions of electoral democracy create opportunities through many welfare measures and anti-poverty programs which generate means of subsistence and alternative sources of livelihood for the poor. Hence, this international seminar is organized to know how the transition from rural agriculture-based feudal economy to urban industrial-based capitalist economy is taking shape and its diverse implication. I wish you all well in this very combined endeavors. Development of technology will also be one tool which the August gathering here, the scholars here should debate on how technology could help in the transition which is happening, whether we can also have a reverse transition if technology can help the agriculture industry. With these few words, I thank the organizers and I thank all the audience for a complete, I should say, I would not like to say spellbound, but maintaining that the decorum of any international seminar and listening very patiently to all the speakers who spoke before me and to me. Thank you all very much.
Respected Vice-Chancellor, Professor Chandra Krishnamurthy, distinguished speakers and the paper presenters of these 3 days international seminar on agrarian transition in India, guests and the faculty members from other institutes, other departments of the Pondicherry University, and the French Institute of Pondicherry, Pondicherry University administrators, our respected finance officer, my dear research scholars, dear students. I stand in front of you with taking the responsibility to propose a vote of thanks to all of you on this occasion. I, on behalf of the organizers of the seminar, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to our respected Vice-Chancellor, Professor Chandra Krishnamurthy, who has readily accepted our invitation to preside over the inaugural section of, in spite of her busy schedule. I like to extend a very special and a big thank you to our most valued invited guest, Professor Joan P. Mecher from City University, New York, who has accepted to deliver our inaugural address for this 3 days international seminar. On behalf of the organizers and on my behalf, I extend a sincere thanks to you, Madam. I'd like to express my gratitude to our respected Professor Venkatratu Raghutman, Dean in charge, School of Social Sciences and International Studies, who is a well-wisher of the Department of Sociology and who is associating himself in all the stages of growth of the department from the date of inception of the department. I extend a sincere thanks to you, Professor. It is my great pleasure to thank Professor B.B. Mohanty, our Professor and Head, Department of Sociology, and convener of this international seminar. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Professor B.B. Mohanty for organizing this seminar and giving me, my colleagues, and my students to meet and interact with seminary scholars from different parts of the world. I extend a sincere thanks to you, sir. I am indeed elated at this large turnover of representations from various universities of different parts of the world. It is an impressive range. My sincere thanks to all of you who are presented here and those who are likely to join us in the days to come. I am sure that you will feel proud of participating in this seminar organized by the Department of Sociology of Pondicherry University, which has well-esteemed faculty members with good academic excellence. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to the French Institute of Pondicherry and Indian Council of Social Science Research, New Delhi, and our Pondicherry University Finance Officer also, for their support and cooperation in organizing this seminar. I thanks to the media friends and the transport for their involvement in organizing this seminar in a successful manner. Thank you very much.